Hello everyone, my name is Mark Jarvis and I'm the visiting professor at Manchester Metropolitan University in the Accounting, Finance and Banking department. So welcome to a monthly series of webinars which looks at issues in the UK economy as well as interesting and innovative issues in our world. This July we will talk happily for a change about the growth of the UK economy before spending some time on the electric vehicle market and perhaps more importantly the electronic vehicle EV charging infrastructure or lack of it. So to start with, let us look at the great headline which reads UK economy growing at fastest rate in 80 years. So the EY Item Club, a forecaster that uses HM Treasury data as a basis, predicts recovery to pre-pandemic levels by year end, although it does come with a health warning. A speedy recovery will depend on consumers spending their savings stockpiled during the pandemic. The British economy is indeed growing at its fastest pace in 80 years, buoyed by the vaccine rollout and a bounce back in consumer spending. The EY Item Club has said it now expects to see GDP grow by 7.6%, which would be the fastest annual growth in national income since 1941. We have to note the UK economy shrank by 9.8% in 2020, the worst performance in the G7, but this bounce back does look encouraging. This optimism comes despite the chaos caused by widespread staff shortages recently reported as workers self-isolate en masse after being pinged by the NHS, National Health Service, Test and Trace. The pingdemic, as it's being known, is affecting the running of shops, restaurants, factories, and even railway services as bosses struggle to find staff to cover shifts. Although the economy has proved increasingly resilient through lockdowns, the EY Item Club report came with the health warning that the future pattern of the pandemic and any renewed pandemic-related restrictions will have a significant bearing on whether the forecast is achieved. The UK economy is more dependent on consumer spending and services such as recreation and leisure activities, which means that the lockdowns had a greater impact on our economy than many other countries. The reopening of these face-to-face parts of the economy means the UK should have a correspondingly faster recovery. In the spring, the group of economists, which is again the only non-government forecasting organisation to use the Treasury's modelling of the economy, penciled in growth of 6.8%. This is the second time this year it's upgraded its forecast, putting the economy on track to attain its pre-pandemic peak by the end of 2021. That milestone would now be reached some 6 months sooner than when it last crunched the numbers in April, with the UK's successful vaccine programme a key factor in underpinning that growth. Recent surveys of economic activity, however, have been less encouraging, leading concerns that the recovery is stalling. The IHS Markit and the SIP survey showed growth at its slowest since March, which was attributed to wide-ranging staff shortages again, the rising COVID cases, and thousands of workers having to isolate owing to this pingdemic. It's also highlighted a new mood of caution among the public, triggered by the rapidly rising infection rates. Again, the EY Item Club report warned that rising inflation, and I'll share a slide with you, and unemployment could affect growth. The group thinks consumer price inflation, already at 2.4%, could hit 3.5% by the end of this year, 2021, before falling again in 2022. And that employment could rise in the second half of the year, peaking at 5.1% before falling back to 4.6% in 2022. So whilst consumers have accumulated their largest stockpile of savings since the Second World War, the big question is whether they will actually start to spend these funds once restrictions on activity are lifted. The assumption is that they will, but it's not guaranteed. The picture for consumers is not entirely positive. Savings are concentrated among higher income households, while higher unemployment and inflation will weigh on this real income growth. Staying on this topic, the ONS, Office of National Statistics, concurs with this growth picture, showing that the UK gross domestic product, GDP, is estimated to have grown by 0.8% in May 2021, the fourth consecutive month of growth, but remains 3.1% below the pre-coronavirus pandemic levels seen in February 2020 last year. The service sector grew by 0.9% in May 2020. Accommodation and food services grew by 37% as restaurants and pubs welcomed customers back indoors following the easing of the restrictions. And output in the production sector returned to growth in May 2021 at 0.8%, mainly because of adverse weather conditions in May, boosting output in electricity and gas. Output in the manufacture of transport equipment, interestingly, fell by 16.5%, its largest fall since April 2020, as microchip shortages disrupted car production. The construction sector, as ever a bellwether sector, contracted for a second consecutive month in May 2021 by 0.8%, but remains still 0.3% above its pre-pandemic level in February 2021. So clearly a good sign there. So come back to a slide. In these series of webinars, we have mused over whether it was a V or a W or an L-shaped recovery post-pandemic. Well, the latest ONS graph shows that it is clearly a V-shaped recovery, the most positive solution, and is really a very encouraging view, as you can see from this slide. An overview of the GDP changes can be seen in this table. Construction, again, is the only sector with output levels above its pre-pandemic level, February 2020, despite 2 consecutive months of contraction. Interestingly, construction output fell for a second month in May, following exceptional growth in February and March. Again, despite the fall, it is up on the pre-pandemic levels. Looking to the next slide, interestingly, the easing of hospitality restrictions in May 2020 has shifted demand from food stores to restaurants and pubs. On the other hand, the easing of the hospitality restrictions had a negative impact on sales by food stores, which make up 39% of total retail sales, but provided a boost to food and beverage service activities, which again make up almost 2.1% of UK GDP as people return to restaurants, bars and cafes. Sales volumes from predominantly food stores fell by 5.7% in May compared with total retail sales falling by 1.4%. Okay, as a segue, let's change gears and look at the electric car market. One argument often brought up against the transition to electric cars is the assertion that, all things considered, electric vehicles aren't that much cleaner than internal combustion engines once you take into account battery production, electricity generation. The emission savings of electric vehicles are minimal at best, so the popular argument goes. To tackle this argument, the International Council on Clean Transportation, ICCT, published a white paper this month comparing life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of combustion engine and electric passenger cars. And from this slide, which I'll just share with you here, taking into account emissions associated with vehicle and battery manufacture, maintenance, fuel consumption, and of course, fuel electricity production, the study finds that electric cars do in fact cut emissions significantly, even in countries where the transition to renewable renewable energy in the electricity mix is still in the early stages. As illustrated in this chart, emissions over the lifetime of a mid-sized electric passenger car registered today are already considerably lower than those of a comparable petrol car. Depending on the current electricity mix and its evolution over the lifetime of the vehicle, emission savings range from 20 to 34% in India to 65 to 70% in Europe. Moreover, as the decarbonisation of energy generation progresses, further the emissions gap between BEVs and cars with combustion engines is expected to widen substantially for cars registered in 2030. Widening the scope to consider other fuel types as well, the report finds that battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles charged by renewable electricity LNG as the cleanest fossil fuel and green hydrogen are the only technologies capable of achieving the emissions reductions in global road transport needed to meet the goals set in the Paris Agreement. Hybrids and plug-in hybrids, the report finds, could be used to reduce fuel consumption during the transition, but neither provide the magnitude of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions needed in the long term. However, and anybody who here has a electric car will know that the lack of charging points across the UK is dampening that enthusiasm. And many of the charger access points, as this map shows, are still very rare and far between, with only London and a few areas on the south coast passing the 60% plus marked in green with a charge access level. Compare this to the global view, and you can see immediately how far the world is behind China, with over 800,000 EV chargers. Obviously, the United States doing well, but the rest of Europe and the big countries around the world still very, very slow behind that. And I think, you know, this is driving reluctance to owning electric cars. In the survey, the main barriers for ownership can be seen in this slide. Obviously, vehicle cost is important, electricity bills, but worried about charging times and don't know how to charge continues to be a very big point. And whilst you would think charging stations, charging locations are up and running exponentially, you can see here that in the UK there is flattening out, and those EV charging points are slowing down. So what does this all mean? Well, 2019 and 2020 have been a good 2 years with charging infrastructure growing, but the rate to increase to 2030 will need to be much greater if the UK is to meet its targets. Our expectation is that EV sales and EV public charging provision will leapfrog each other over the next few years. The market for the car sales is still quite fragile and nascent, and demand is very much dependent on tax breaks and subsidies. So if any of these incentives are removed before EV price parity is reached, growth in the market could stall. With the UK government's November 2020 announcement of a green industrial plan, Prime Minister Boris Johnson reaffirmed a commitment to accelerate the rollout of charging infrastructure in England, with 1.3 billion to be made available through a number of existing and proposed funds, including the Charging Infrastructure Investment Fund and the Rapid Charging Fund. Private sector investment has responded to these signals by providing finance for the EV charging infrastructure over the past 4 years, but a lot more will be needed. At present, not all segments of the market are commercially viable, and this is likely to remain the case for a while. Therefore, our funding models will be needed, such as combinations of international financial institutions, national, local governments, equity providers, and increasingly debt providers and banks. Yet, as the market expands, so too do the opportunities for players in this space. The variety of the value chain is reflected in the investment opportunities. We are seeing a broad range of investors come to the market, from the venture types seeking higher risk and higher returns to the more conservative infrastructure fund types. The longer-term trend is not in question. Zero-emission vehicles will make up an increasing proportion of vehicles on the road, and the provision of public charging infrastructure will continue to be an essential third leg, along with vehicle price and battery range, in increasing and accelerating the demand for e-mobility. So finally, a word about the grid, and the EV uptake is likely to grow once rapid and ultra-fast chargers become widespread. The expansion of fast charging networks will need to be managed in concert with the grid updates. This will be particularly important in locations where EV uptake is high, where the existing network is weak, or where high power charging is required, such as urban fast charging, motorway service areas, excuse me, and fleet depots. For rapid and ultra-fast hubs, utility upgrade costs represent a significant part of the investment. In an analysis of the 50 kilowatt chargers at the rapid charge network stations along the motorways, hardware costs range between 50 and 6% of total capex, and newer power connections and installation 12 to 21%. Strategies can be implemented to alleviate the impact, I think. One is smart charging. EV drivers respond to signals from the grid, such as pricing or energy supply, to stop, start, or moderate charging. Another approach is to build chargers at locations with ample capacity and lower installation costs. According to the National Grid, 60% of the 165 motorway service sites in England and Wales are within 5 kilometres of the transmission network infrastructure, and 20% within 1 kilometre. They estimate that ultra-fast charging at 50 strategic motorway service locations would enable 95% of drivers in England and Wales to be within 80 kilometres of a charging station. The cost for that is not cheap, around £1 billion. Another strategy from the National Grid is working on a strategy to combine fast charging with stationary energy storage. It's embarked on a £1.6 billion program to install a 2 gigawatt battery network spanning 45 electricity substations across the UK over the next 5 years. However, to date, only 3 sites have received planning permission and none built. So again, this is 5 years away, and I think we need some fast solutions here, some off-grid solutions to really take us through the next 5 to 7 years. If we don't get the off-grid solutions sooner rather than later, then the electric car uptake will continue to be very sluggish. So thank you for listening. I hope it was interesting. I'm Mark Jarvis, and it's been a pleasure to be with you for this 20 minutes. Thank you. Bye-bye.